The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on being the sort of place where the most scandalous event of any given year was likely to be Mrs. Price Ridley's annual dispute with the vicar over the church flower arrangements. Murder, as Miss Jane Marple often reflected, was something that happened in the newspapers. Distant, dramatic affairs involving people one had never met and never would. It was not the sort of thing that disrupted the orderly progression of village fete, parish meetings, and the gentle gossip that flowed as regularly as tea from Mrs. Bantry's best china service. This particular Saturday afternoon in late June, however, was destined to prove that even St. Mary Mead was not immune to the darker impulses of human nature. The annual vicarage fete was in full swing, blessed with that rarest of English phenomena, genuine sunshine that showed no immediate inclination to disappear behind a bank of threatening clouds. The vicarage lawn had been transformed into its yearly carnival of respectability. White canvas marquees fluttered in the gentle breeze. The brass band from Much Benham played with more enthusiasm than skill, and the usual collection of village worthies presided over their respective domains with the territorial pride of medieval barons. Miss Marple sat in a comfortable wicker chair, positioned strategically near the tea tent, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm that had become as much a part of her as her soft white hair and deceptively mild blue eyes. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a harmless elderly spinster, perhaps slightly deaf, certainly unimportant. Those who knew her better, such as her nephew Raymond, who was currently queuing for cucumber sandwiches with the resigned air of a man fulfilling familial obligations, understood that she was, in fact, recording and cataloguing every nuance of human behavior within her considerable range of observation. "The usual cast of characters, I see," Raymond remarked as he returned with a plate of refreshments and settled into the chair beside her. "Though I must say, Aunt Jane, the drama seems rather thin this year, unless you count Colonel Bantry's ongoing feud with the croquet hoops." Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles never pausing. "Oh, my dear Raymond, you always look for excitement in the wrong places. Human nature provides quite enough drama without the need for theatrical gestures. Take Mrs. Cynthia Weatherby, for instance." She nodded discreetly toward an elegantly dressed woman in her early 50s who stood near the coconut shy, her posture rigid with barely concealed tension. "She has been watching the gate for the past 20 minutes with the expression of someone expecting either salvation or damnation, and quite unsure which would be preferable." Raymond followed his aunt's gaze with interest. Mrs. Weatherby was indeed a study in nervous anticipation, her gloved hands clasping and unclasping around her small beaded purse while her eyes remained fixed on the main entrance to the vicarage grounds. "She moved to Rose Cottage 6 months ago," Miss Marple continued in her gentle, conversational tone. "A widow, she claims, though there has been some speculation about the precise circumstances of her widowhood. Her stepdaughter, Miss Elspeth, lives with her, that pale, anxious-looking girl by the tombola. Poor child reminds me of a sparrow I once rescued that never quite learned to trust that the cat had been permanently banished from the garden." As if summoned by their attention, a commotion near the gate drew every eye in the gathering. A man had appeared at the entrance, tall, perhaps 45, with graying temples and the sort of confident bearing that spoke of someone accustomed to command. He wore a well-tailored dark suit that marked him immediately as a stranger to St. Mary Mead, where such formality was reserved for funerals and the occasional visit from the bishop. The effect of his appearance on Mrs. Weatherby was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face so completely that her carefully applied rouge stood out like fever spots, and the small purse slipped from her nerveless fingers to land with a soft thud on the grass. "Good heavens," she whispered, the words carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests. "It cannot be. Not here. Not now." The stranger's eyes swept the gathering with the methodical precision of someone conducting a search, and when his gaze fell upon Mrs. Weatherby, his lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile, though it contained no warmth whatsoever. He did not approach her immediately. Instead, he lit a cigarette, a breach of etiquette in the vicar's rose garden that caused several sharp intakes of breath, and waited with the patient confidence of a cat watching a mouse hole. Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled for the first time in an hour. "Most interesting," she murmured, her bright eyes taking in every detail of the tableau before them. "That is not the greeting of old friends, I think." The stranger's presence seemed to cast a shadow over the entire gathering, though the sun continued to shine with undiminished brightness. Conversations became forced and artificial. Laughter sounded brittle, and even the brass band seemed to lose some of its vigorous enthusiasm. Mrs. Weatherby stood frozen for several long moments before gathering herself with visible effort and making her way toward the house with the measured pace of someone walking to the scaffold. "I believe I shall take a turn about the grounds," the stranger announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been foreign or might simply have been the result of too many years spent in places where English was not the native tongue. Such a charming village. So peaceful. He began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the gathering, his presence causing conversations to falter and groups to shift uncomfortably as he passed. Miss Marple noted that his route would inevitably take him past the small summer house at the far end of the garden, the same destination toward which Mrs. Weatherby was making her determined way. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said quietly, "I have the distinct feeling we are about to witness something rather more dramatic than the usual village fete entertainment." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, carefully folding her knitting and placing it in her capacious bag. "And I suspect, my dear Raymond, that before this afternoon is over, we shall discover that some secrets are far too dangerous to remain buried, no matter how peaceful the village that harbors them." It was at that precise moment that the scream shattered the gentle afternoon air, a sound of pure terror that seemed to come from the direction of the summer house, where Mrs. Weatherby and the stranger had both disappeared from view just minutes before. The effect was instantaneous. Dr. Haydock dropped his teacup and ran toward the sound, his medical training overriding social convention. The vicar, his round face flushed with confusion and concern, hurried after him. Within moments, a crowd had gathered near the small ornamental building, their excited voices creating a buzz of speculation and alarm. Miss Marple did not hurry. Her rheumatism would not permit such haste, but she made her way steadily toward the commotion with the determined air of someone who had learned through long experience that the most important details were often overlooked in the first chaotic moments following a crisis. By the time she reached the summer house, the crowd had been organized into a respectful semicircle by Police Constable Polk, who had been enjoying a well-earned cup of tea when duty called. Dr. Haydock emerged from the small building, his face grave. "I'm afraid the gentleman is dead," he announced soberly. "Appears to be a blow to the head. Quite instantaneous, I should think." A collective gasp arose from the assembled villagers. Murder in St. Mary Mead was unprecedented, shocking, almost incomprehensible. "Where is Mrs. Weatherby?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Haydock looked puzzled. "Mrs. Weatherby? I haven't seen her. The body was discovered by young Timothy Bates. He was retrieving a cricket ball that had gone astray." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in this information. She moved closer to the summer house, her keen gaze taking in the scattered gravel, the overturned garden chair, and most particularly the curious pattern of disturbed earth near the entrance. "Constable Polk," she said gently, "I wonder if you might examine the victim's shoes." The constable looked at her with the patient tolerance of a man accustomed to humoring elderly ladies. "His shoes, Miss Marple?" "Yes, dear. You see there is mud on the heels, but grass stains on the toes. Rather curious, don't you think, for someone who was supposedly struck down where he stood?" Constable Polk dutifully examined the evidence, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. That is odd." "Indeed," she murmured, her gaze traveling from the body to the disturbed earth, to the small gate that led from the summer house to the lane beyond. It is almost as if someone wanted us to find him here, but not necessarily at this precise moment. One might say, Constable, that we have discovered not just a murder, but a murderer who found it necessary to return, to move the body." The implications of her words settled over the gathering like a chill wind, and Miss Marple reflected that the peaceful afternoon in St. Mary Mead had taken a turn that would require all her considerable understanding of human nature to unravel. The mystery had begun, and she suspected that before it was solved, many of the village's most carefully guarded secrets would be brought into the harsh light of day. The arrival of Inspector Slack was heralded by the aggressive slamming of car doors and an air of harassed authority that seemed to rebuke the very notion of a peaceful village fete. He strode across the vicarage lawn with the determined gait of a man who found the entire concept of garden parties personally offensive, his face set in an expression that suggested murder was an inconvenience he could ill afford on a Saturday afternoon. The fete had not so much ended as transformed into something entirely different, a series of hushed, urgent clusters where speculation flowed as freely as the tea had done an hour earlier. The white marquees fluttered forlornly in the evening breeze, their festive purpose abandoned in favor of providing strategic vantage points for observation and gossip. "I knew it from the moment she arrived," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, her ample bosom heaving with the significance of her pronouncement as she held court near the abandoned cake stall. "Mrs. Weatherby, I mean. A woman who receives no morning callers and keeps her curtains drawn until noon is clearly harboring secrets. And now this, a stranger struck down practically on her doorstep. It reeks of a crime of passion." Miss Hartnell nodded vigorously, her voice carrying across the lawn with its customary authority. "Fled, I shouldn't wonder. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Did you see her face when that man appeared? White as a sheet she was, like she'd seen a ghost, or perhaps a blackmailer." Colonel Bantry, abandoning his beloved croquet mallets for the more pressing entertainment of amateur detection, stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "The question is, who was the fellow? Never seen him before in my life. Had a foreign look about him, I thought. Could be one of those international criminals one reads about." Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position near the tea tent, noted that while the village matrons were busy constructing their theories, young Elspeth Weatherby stood alone near the edge of the woods, her pale hands twisting a lace handkerchief into knots. The girl was not looking toward the summer house or the police activity, but rather toward the dense copse leading to the old mill, her expression one of terrified anticipation. Inspector Slack's voice boomed across the lawn as he addressed Constable Polk with characteristic impatience. "And you say this old lady suggested the body had been moved? Rubbish. The man was hit on the head. He fell. He died. Why would anyone drag a corpse around a garden party?" "Well, sir," Polk ventured, "the shoes, you see. Mud on the heels, but grass stains on the toes, just as Miss Marple observed. Suggests he was dragged backwards." Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple's chair, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the harassed expression of a man who had been answering identical questions for the past hour. "Single blow to the back of the head," he reported quietly. "Something heavy and blunt. The police surgeon agrees it would have been instantaneous, but the weapon's nowhere to be found." "How very convenient for someone," Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "And yet, if one were committing murder in a summer house, why take the trouble to move the body afterward? It suggests either remarkable nerve or remarkable desperation." At that moment, Raymond West approached with information gleaned from his gentle questioning of Elspeth. "The victim's name was Gerald Linden," he reported quietly to his aunt. "Apparently, he was Mrs. Weatherby's late husband's business partner. The girl seems terrified, but she insists she knows nothing about why he came here today." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. A business partner from the past. How very illuminating. And yet the poor man carried expensive cigarettes, but cheap matches in his pocket. Rather suggestive of someone maintaining appearances while perhaps struggling with reduced circumstances. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had descended upon the remaining witnesses with the enthusiasm of a terrier, demanding alibis and growing increasingly frustrated with the vague, contradictory responses that village social events inevitably produced. His aggressive questioning of Elspeth was visible from across the lawn, the girls shrinking back with each barked inquiry. "The village has already decided," Raymond observed, watching the clusters of gossiping neighbors. "They've convicted Mrs. Weatherby in absentia. If she returns now, she'll face a tribunal of public opinion." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But people flee for many reasons, dear. Fear is often more powerful than guilt. And I cannot help but wonder about the timing of Mr. Linden's arrival. Such a public venue for a private confrontation suggests either remarkable boldness or the belief that witnesses might provide protection." As the shadows lengthened across the trampled grass, the festive atmosphere had entirely vanished, replaced by a cold unease that seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead like evening mist. The murder had been committed, the police had taken charge, and the village had closed ranks, ready to defend its respectability by casting out the newcomer who had brought violence to their peaceful world. But Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her mind working not on the grand drama of obvious guilt, but on the small inconsistencies that suggested a more complex truth lay hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward crime of passion. By evening, the vicarage grounds had taken on the subdued atmosphere of a battlefield after the fighting has moved elsewhere. The marquees stood empty, their cheerful bunting now seeming almost mocking in the gathering dusk. Inspector Slack emerged from behind the summer house with the satisfied expression of a man who had found exactly what he expected to find. A heavy cast-iron doorstop shaped like a sleeping cat, its base darkly stained with what required no medical expertise to identify. "There's your weapon," he announced to Sergeant Lake, holding the object wrapped in his handkerchief. "Usually props open the summer house door, according to the vicar. Perfect weight for the job, and she would have known exactly where to find it." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her position near the abandoned tea tent, approached with the slow, careful steps of someone whose rheumatism demanded respect. "How interesting, Inspector. And where precisely was it discovered?" "Thrown into the rhododendrons about 20 feet from the scene. Guilty conscience, I'd say. Couldn't bear to look at what she'd done." Slack's tone suggested he found the psychology of murder both simple and distasteful. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, though her expression remained thoughtful. "And yet, if I may observe, when I passed the summer house earlier to admire the roses, such lovely specimens the vicar grows, the door was propped open with a wooden wedge. That particular doorstop usually sits on the inside mantelpiece, does it not, Vicar?" The Reverend Clement, who had been hovering nearby with the anxious air of a man whose peaceful domain had been violated, nodded absently. "Yes, quite right. My wife finds it too heavy to move, so it remains there as decoration most of the time." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their steady rhythm, paused for a moment. "So Mrs. Weatherby would have had to enter the summer house, remove a heavy object from a high shelf, and then wait for the proper moment to use it. Rather suggests forethought, wouldn't you say?" Inspector Slack's expression suggested he would not say any such thing, but before he could respond, young Timothy Bates was brought forward by Constable Polk. The boy clutched a cricket ball to his chest like a talisman and regarded the assembled adults with the wide-eyed wariness of someone who had stumbled into a world far more complex than cricket matches and village fetes. "Tell the inspector what you told me about the smell, lad," Polk encouraged gently. Timothy's voice was barely above a whisper. "When I went in to get my ball, sir, it smelled funny, like pipe tobacco, but sweet too, made me want to sneeze." "Perfume," Miss Marple said quietly. "How observant of you, Timothy. Rather heavy perfume, I should imagine." The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, miss. Like what Mrs. Price Ridley wears to church." A curious silence fell over the group. Mrs. Weatherby, as several villagers could attest, favored only the faintest lavender water, a preference that had been noted and approved by the village ladies as appropriately modest for a widow in reduced circumstances. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the scene with professional thoroughness, looked up from his position near the summer-house entrance. "There's something else rather odd, Inspector. The victim's shoes show mud on the heels, but grass stains on the toes. Suggests he was dragged backward some distance." "Dragged from where?" Slack demanded, his confidence beginning to show hairline cracks. "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is indeed the question, isn't it? You see, Inspector, I cannot help but think of my great-nephew's magic shows. The most important part is not the trick itself, but directing the audience's attention to the wrong place at the crucial moment." She gestured delicately toward the evidence bag containing Mrs. Weatherby's violet-patterned scarf, found folded, rather too neatly folded, near the summer-house entrance. When one drops a scarf in panic, it flutters and crumples. It does not arrange itself in a tidy square, as if someone wished to ensure it would be noticed. The implications of her observation settled over the group like evening mist. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 7 o'clock, and the ordinary sounds of village life, a dog barking, children being called in for supper, seemed to emphasize how extraordinary the afternoon had become. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. "You're suggesting someone wanted us to find these things? That Mrs. Weatherby was deliberately implicated?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic mildness, "that someone has gone to considerable trouble to present us with a very tidy solution to what may be a rather untidy problem. And in my experience, Inspector, when things appear too convenient, it is usually because someone has taken great pains to make them so." As the last light faded from the vicarage garden, it became clear that the investigation was far from over, and that the truth lay hidden beneath layers of careful deception that would require all of Miss Marple's understanding of human nature to unravel. The morning after the murder dawned with that peculiarly English combination of brilliant sunshine and underlying tension that made St. Mary Mead's residents linger over their breakfast tea longer than usual. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Slack had commandeered the Blue Boar's private dining room, transforming the cozy inn into an impromptu headquarters where the scent of stale tobacco mingled with the lingering aroma of kippers and the sharp tang of suspicion. Miss Marple arrived ostensibly to deliver Raymond's forgotten spectacles, but somehow found herself settled in a corner chair with her knitting, so unobtrusive that Inspector Slack appeared to forget her presence entirely. Her needles moved with their customary rhythm as she observed the parade of witnesses, each adding their own thread to the increasingly complex tapestry of the case. Arthur Badcock, the young mechanic from the village garage, twisted his oil-stained cap nervously as he faced the inspector's aggressive questioning. "I saw the dead bloke arrive, sir. About 2 o'clock it were. Drove up in a fancy motor car and parked it deliberate-like behind the hedgerow near the old mill road. Hidden proper, if you ask me." "Hidden?" Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the room's tension. "How very interesting. A man planning a public confrontation at a village fete usually announces his arrival quite prominently. To conceal one's vehicle suggests either shame or the need for a private meeting before any public appearance." Inspector Slack frowned but pressed on. "Did you see anyone meet him there, Arthur?" "Well, sir, I did see Miss Elspeth walking that way about 10 minutes after. Looking scared as a rabbit she was. And there was something odd about his car, engine running rough, needed work. But what struck me most was the suitcase on the back seat. Packed full, it looked, like he was planning a long journey." Before Slack could respond, a commotion in the inn's main room announced a new arrival. Young Elspeth Weatherby appeared in the doorway, her pale face streaked with tears and her hands clutching a worn leather notebook as if it were her only anchor to sanity. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me you were here. I must speak with you. I cannot bear this any longer." The girl's appearance transformed the atmosphere entirely. Gone was the fragile, sparrow-like creature who had hovered at the edges of yesterday's festivities. In her place stood someone driven by desperation to a kind of courage. "My stepmother didn't kill Mr. Linden," Elspeth declared, sinking into the chair Raymond quickly provided. "But I'm afraid I know why he came here, and it's far worse than anyone imagines." She opened the notebook with shaking hands, revealing pages of meticulous accounts written in a masculine hand. "This belonged to my father. He kept 2 sets of books for his business, one for the authorities and one recording the actual transactions. Mr. Linden wasn't just his partner. They were smuggling Egyptian antiquities and selling them to private collectors." Miss Marple accepted the notebook, her experienced eyes scanning the careful entries. Each page told a story of increasing desperation, a man caught between profit and conscience, recording his own moral decline with accountant's precision. "My father wanted to confess everything," Elspeth continued, her voice growing stronger. "He'd written to the British Museum, offering to return several pieces and provide information about the smuggling network. But Mr. Linden refused to let him withdraw from their partnership." "And your father's death in Cairo?" Raymond asked gently. "Officially, he fell from a hotel balcony while intoxicated. But my father never touched spirits. His doctor had forbidden it due to a weak heart. My stepmother always believed Mr. Linden pushed him, though nothing could ever be proven." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by the calculating look of a man reassessing his entire case. "So Linden came here to what? Blackmail your stepmother about her knowledge of the smuggling?" "Or perhaps," Miss Marple observed quietly, folding her knitting with deliberate care, "he came to retrieve something. A man packing for a long journey and hiding his vehicle suggests flight rather than extortion. And the perfume Timothy Bates detected in the summer house. Quite heavy and sweet, nothing like Mrs. Weatherby's modest lavender water. Suggests someone else was present at the crucial moment." The morning sunlight slanted through the inn's diamond-paned windows, illuminating the notebook's damning pages. As the implications settled over the assembled group, it became clear that Gerald Linden's death was not the simple crime of passion it had initially appeared, but the violent culmination of secrets that had festered for 15 years, waiting for the perfect moment to demand their terrible price. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her bright blue eyes remained thoughtful. The case was far from solved, and she suspected that before it was over, several more of St. Mary Mead's most respectable residents would find their carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of long-buried truths. The morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that often follows a night of troubled sleep, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to the village post office with the determined air of someone following a half-formed intuition. Mrs. Gummidge, the postmistress, was engaged in her usual morning ritual of sorting the mail while simultaneously dispensing commentary on the previous day's dramatic events to anyone within earshot. "Such a to-do," Mrs. Gummidge was saying to Miss Hartnell, who had arrived ostensibly to purchase stamps, but clearly to gather intelligence. "Murder in our very own village, though I must say I'm not entirely surprised. That Mrs. Weatherby always struck me as having secrets." Miss Marple approached the counter with her characteristic gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Gummidge. I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. My nephew mentioned some confusion with the post delivery last week." Mrs. Gummidge's eyes brightened at the opportunity to discuss her professional domain. "Oh, yes, indeed. That new postman, young Albert, made quite a muddle of Thursday's delivery. 3 letters meant for the vicarage ended up at Rose Cottage, and Mrs. Weatherby's gardening catalogue went to Colonel Bantry. I had to sort it all out myself on Friday morning. Rose Cottage received the vicarage mail." Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "How very confusing for poor Mrs. Weatherby." The stepdaughter brought them back, very apologetic she was. Said her stepmother had been quite distressed by one of the envelopes, opened it by mistake, thinking it was hers. Went quite pale, according to young Elspeth. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Gummidge and made her way thoughtfully toward the Blue Boar, where she discovered that Mrs. Weatherby had returned to the village in the company of a stern-looking gentleman from London. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the frightened widow of yesterday, replaced by a woman who had clearly decided that dignity was preferable to flight. "Inspector Slack," Mrs. Weatherby was saying as Miss Marple approached. "I'm prepared to answer your questions in the presence of my solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, but I wish to state clearly that while I did not kill Gerald Linden, I confess I'm not sorry he is dead." The brutal honesty of this declaration seemed to rob the inspector of speech momentarily. Mr. Pemberton, a sharp-featured man with calculating eyes, stepped forward smoothly. "My client wishes to provide a complete statement regarding yesterday's events and her connection to the deceased." "I fled," Mrs. Weatherby continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "because I was terrified, but not for the reasons you might think. On Thursday, I accidentally opened a letter addressed to the vicar. It was from Gerald, saying he intended to confess everything about the smuggling operation to clear his conscience before leaving England. When he appeared at the fete, I went to the summer house to beg him to reconsider, not to kill him, but to protect my late husband's reputation." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "And when you arrived at the summer house?" Mrs. Weatherby's composure wavered slightly. "He was already dead. But I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading toward the old hall, and there was a distinctive smell. Sweet, cloying, like lilies and stale tobacco mixed together." "The old hall path," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "That particular route led past several properties, including the back garden of Claude's Antiques, where Mr. Simon Claude, a man who often spoke of his time in Cairo and was known for his fondness for Turkish cigarettes, conducted his mysterious business in rare and unusual objects. At that moment, Colonel Bantry appeared, his ruddy face grave with concern. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to find you here. That Inspector fellow has been asking some rather pointed questions about my dealings with Egyptian antiquities. Seems that Linden chap visited me last week, asking about a statuette I'd purchased years ago in Cairo. Nasty thing with a bird's head that my wife always said gave her the shivers." "And your intermediary in that transaction?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Fellow from London who boasted of having contacts in the quiet parts of the country, who could store things discreetly. Mentioned our very own county specifically." Bantry's discomfort was evident. "I only dealt with him once. Didn't like his manner." Miss Marple absorbed this information while her mind worked furiously to connect the various threads. The postal mix-up had revealed Gerald Linden's intention to confess, which explained Mrs. Weatherby's panic. But someone else had been at the summer house, someone who smoked Turkish cigarettes and had access to the old hall path. Someone who might have been the country intermediary the colonel had mentioned, and who would have every reason to prevent Gerald Linden from making his confession to the authorities. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple realized that the smuggling operation had not died with Mr. Weatherby 15 years ago. It had simply changed management, finding a new base of operations in the most respectable of English villages, where no one would think to look for international criminals among the antique dealers and country gentlemen. The murderer, she suspected, was not only still among them, but was someone who had been quietly watching the investigation unfold, confident that suspicion would fall elsewhere while they remained safely hidden behind a facade of village respectability. The afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar tension that follows public scandal, when every conversation carries undercurrents of speculation and every glance seems weighted with significance. Miss Marple, having taken a light luncheon, announced her intention to take a constitutional before tea. A phrase that her maid had long since learned meant her mistress was pursuing a line of inquiry that required careful observation. Her seemingly aimless walk took her first past the vicarage grounds, where the police had finished their examination, then along the narrow lane that skirted the back gardens of the High Street properties. It was here that she paused at the low gate of Claude's Antiques, where Mr. Simon Claude was supervising the packing of several wooden crates in his rear yard. Such industrious activity, Miss Marple observed pleasantly, her knitting bag balanced carefully on her arm. "You must find our village excitement rather tame after your travels, Mr. Claude." He straightened from his work, wiping his hands on a cloth, his dark eyes narrowing for just an instant before his habitual charm reasserted itself. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to stop by, though I confess, yesterday's events were rather more excitement than any of us bargained for." His accent carried the faintest trace of something foreign, carefully modulated by years of English respectability. Miss Marple's gaze rested, apparently casually, on the half-packed crate where a corner of carved stone protruded from the protective straw. The graceful curve suggested a bird's wing, reminiscent of the Egyptian pieces she had seen in museum catalogues. Colonel Bantry was speaking this morning of a similar statuette that once belonged to him. He mentioned purchasing it through a London dealer with country connections. For the briefest moment, Claude's hands stilled. Then he laughed, but the sound held a hollow note. These provincial collectors do love their exotic pieces. This particular item is bound for a museum in London. Proper appreciation, you understand. Miss Marple smiled and made a few pleasant remarks about the weather before continuing her walk. But instead of returning home, she followed the narrow path that led from behind Claude's property toward the old mill stream. The gravel here showed signs of recent disturbance, scuff marks, broken twigs, and most tellingly, the scattered remains of a foreign matchbox, its ornate lettering still visible on the cardboard fragments. An hour later, she found herself in the village library, where Miss Bunner maintained meticulous records of local publications. After careful searching through back issues of the County Chronicle, Miss Marple discovered what she sought: a small notice from 13 years prior announcing Mr. Simon Claude's purchase of the former Blackett property and his establishment of an antique business. The date was significant. Less than 2 years after Mr. Weatherby's fatal accident in Cairo. The timing suggested that Claude had not merely inherited customers from the smuggling operation, he had taken it over entirely, using his respectable antique business as the perfect cover for moving stolen artifacts through legitimate channels. Raymond found his aunt emerging from the library, her expression thoughtful. "You've discovered something important," he observed, falling into step beside her. "I have discovered," Miss Marple replied quietly, "that our Mr. Claude arrived in St. Mary Mead at a most convenient time to continue certain profitable but illegal activities. But I have also learned something else of great interest from my conversation with the station master." Raymond's eyebrows rose. The station master. Indeed. It seems that Gerald Linden arrived yesterday not by motor car, as young Arthur Badcock reported, but by the 1:15 train from London. The car near the old mill was rented in Much Benham under the name Mr. Smith, a gentleman of medium height, wearing spectacles and a dark coat. "Claude?" Raymond breathed. "Very likely. But more importantly, the station master distinctly remembers Mr. Linden carrying a small leather satchel when he disembarked. That satchel was not found with the body." Miss Marple paused beside the churchyard gate, her mind working through the implications. "You see, dear Raymond, I believe Gerald Linden came here not to blackmail Mrs. Weatherby, but to meet someone he trusted, someone he believed would help him make his confession to the authorities. But that person betrayed him." "Precisely. And then faced the problem of a body in the wrong location, quite possibly on his own property, and evidence that needed to be recovered. Hence the necessity of moving poor Mr. Linden to the summer house and arranging the scene to implicate Mrs. Weatherby." They walked in contemplative silence until they reached the vicarage, where Inspector Slack emerged, looking more harassed than usual. "Ah, Miss Marple," he called. "Glad to see you. We've had another development. Turns out that doorstop was wiped completely clean. Not even the vicar's fingerprints on it, though he handles it regular-like when opening the summer house windows." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very thorough of someone. The sort of thoroughness one might expect from a person accustomed to handling valuable objects. Someone who would naturally wear fine leather gloves, even on a warm summer afternoon." "Gloves?" Slack frowned. Consider, Inspector, the habits of someone who deals daily with precious antiques. Such a person would no more touch a valuable object with bare hands than a surgeon would operate without proper preparation. It becomes second nature, the sort of detail that might seem insignificant until one realizes. It explains why a hastily discarded murder weapon bears no fingerprints whatsoever. As the implications of her observation settled over the group, Miss Marple reflected that the case was approaching its climax. The murderer had been clever, methodical, and ruthless, but had made the fatal error of assuming that in a quiet village no one would notice the small inconsistencies that revealed careful planning behind an apparently impulsive crime. The truth about Gerald Linden's death lay not in passion or panic, but in the cold calculation of someone who had built a life of respectability on a foundation of crime and who would kill to protect that carefully constructed facade. The evening brought with it a soft, persistent rain that seemed to wash the harsh edges from St. Mary Mead's recent trauma, though it could do nothing to cleanse the village of its newly acquired knowledge of human wickedness. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles moving in their customary rhythm, when she observed an unexpected figure hurrying along the lane. Elspeth Weatherby, clutching something wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, her pale face set with the determination of someone who has finally found the courage to speak truth. The girl arrived at Miss Marple's door, breathless and trembling, but with a steadiness in her voice that had been absent since the murder. "Miss Marple, I must show you something. I should have brought it forward yesterday, but I was frightened. Now I realize that silence serves only the guilty." She unwrapped her burden to reveal a small limestone figurine, exquisitely carved in the Egyptian style. A seated cat with almond-shaped eyes that seemed to watch them with ancient wisdom. The piece was unmistakably authentic, clearly valuable, and undoubtedly stolen. "Mr. Linden gave this to my stepmother years ago before my father's death," Elspeth explained, her words coming in a rush. "She always believed it was merely a tourist trinket, but 3 weeks ago, Mr. Claude came to call. He was charming, interested in our family history, asking about mementos from Egypt. When she showed him this piece, his entire demeanor changed, his eyes fixed on it with such intensity that my stepmother became frightened." Miss Marple turned the figurine carefully in her hands, noting the smoothness of the stone and the precision of the carving. He recognized it, didn't he? Not as a random artifact, but as a specific piece he had been expecting to find. "Yes." He asked to borrow it for appraisal, but she refused. After he left, she hid it away and made me promise never to mention it to anyone. But when Gerald Linden was killed, I began to understand that this little cat might be the reason he died. At that moment, Raymond arrived with disturbing news from the village. "Inspector Slack has arrested Claude," he reported, shaking rain from his coat. "Found him at the station with a packed suitcase and a ticket to Liverpool. But here's the curious thing. When they searched his shop, they discovered several pieces of obviously Egyptian origin, all carefully packed for shipment." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Packed for shipment, you say? How very interesting. A man fleeing for his life rarely takes time to wrap merchandise with professional care." "There's more," Raymond continued. "They found Gerald Linden's missing satchel hidden in the coal shed behind the shop. It contained documentation of the entire smuggling operation, names, dates, shipping records, everything. Claude claims he's never seen it before." "And do you believe him?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Actually, I do. The hiding place was too obvious, too easily discovered. It felt staged, like someone wanted the police to find it there." Miss Marple nodded slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "Consider the sequence of events, my dears. Gerald Linden arrives in St. Mary Mead carrying documentation that would expose a 15-year-old smuggling operation. He meets someone, presumably to arrange the proper return of stolen artifacts and provide evidence to authorities. Instead, he is murdered. But the killer faces a problem. A body in the wrong location and incriminating evidence that must be recovered. She rose and moved to the window, watching the rain blur the village lights into soft halos. The solution is elegant in its simplicity. Move the body to a location where suspicion will fall on someone else. Mrs. Weatherby, who had clear motive and opportunity. Plant evidence to support that theory. Then, when the investigation begins to point toward the true culprit, provide an alternative suspect who is guilty of related crimes, but not of murder. "You're saying Claude is being framed?" Elspeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that Mr. Claude, while certainly guilty of receiving stolen goods, has become a convenient scapegoat for someone far more dangerous. Someone who has been watching this investigation unfold from a position of perfect trust, guiding it subtly toward the desired conclusion." The implications settled over them like the evening mist. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was continuing their normal routine, confident that their careful manipulation had succeeded. But Miss Marple's keen understanding of human nature had detected the pattern beneath the deception, the small inconsistencies that revealed a mind capable of both meticulous planning and ruthless execution. "The question now," she said, carefully wrapping the Egyptian figurine in its oilcloth covering, "is not who killed Gerald Linden, but how to prove it before our true murderer realizes that their web of misdirection is beginning to unravel. And I believe, my dears, that tomorrow will provide us with the opportunity to set a trap that will require only the slightest pressure to spring shut." The rain continued to fall, washing the village clean for whatever revelations the morning might bring. The morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that follows a night of careful thought, and Miss Marple found herself moved to action with the quiet determination of someone who had finally assembled all the pieces of a particularly complex puzzle. She dispatched several carefully worded notes before breakfast, each one phrased with the innocent courtesy that had served her so well in previous investigations. By 11 o'clock, she had gathered a select group in the vicarage drawing room under the pretext of discussing the unfortunate disruption to church activities. The vicar, still looking somewhat shell-shocked by recent events, poured tea with trembling hands, while Inspector Slack occupied his usual position of barely contained impatience. Dr. Haydock stood near the window, his professional composure intact despite the strain of the past 2 days, occasionally glancing toward his medical bag as though expecting an urgent call. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began in her gentle, conversational tone, "about the curious problem of timing in this case. You see, Inspector, while everyone has focused on when Gerald Linden died, I find myself more interested in when he was moved." She withdrew her knitting and settled it carefully in her lap, though her needles remained still. "Young Arthur Badcock from the garage has been most helpful, though I suspect he didn't realize the significance of what he observed. Arthur, you see, was working at Mr. Claude's shop that afternoon, helping to pack crates for urgent shipment, as he told me this morning. But he also noticed something else." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his earlier confidence in having solved the case beginning to show cracks. "What did he see?" Dr. Haydock's motor car, parked behind the surgery at precisely 4:15, when Arthur took his tea break. The curious thing is that Dr. Haydock was supposedly examining the body at the summer house at 4:30. Rather quick work, even for someone as efficient as our good doctor. Dr. Haydock's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his teacup. "I may have glanced at my watch incorrectly in all the excitement, Miss Marple. These things happen during crises." "Oh, of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But then there was the matter of the spare key to the summer house. The vicar mentioned it had gone missing from the potting shed yesterday afternoon. Taken, one might assume, by someone who needed access to arrange a scene but couldn't risk being seen breaking in." She paused to adjust her spectacles, a gesture that somehow managed to seem both innocent and accusatory. "And then we have the medical evidence itself. You are so quick to pronounce the death instantaneous, Doctor, and so certain about the weapon used, almost as if you had examined the wound before any of us arrived at the scene." The room had grown very quiet. Outside, a blackbird called once and then fell silent, as though even nature was holding its breath. But what truly convinced me, Miss Marple continued, was the smell young Timothy Bates detected in the summer house. Not perfume, as we initially thought, but something medical, something that would mask other scents and leave a distinctive sweetness in the air. Chloroform, perhaps, which would be readily available to someone with medical training. Dr. Haydock set down his teacup with deliberate care. Miss Marple, I must protest. These are serious accusations based on the flimsiest of circumstantial evidence. Indeed they are, she replied calmly. Which is why I took the liberty of examining the path behind your surgery this morning, Doctor. The rain had washed away most traces, but not all. There were still fragments of a distinctive matchbox, the Turkish variety you favor, and a small stain on the flagstones that I believe will prove most interesting to the police laboratory. She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small evidence envelope. I also found this caught on the hedge, a handkerchief bearing the monogram J.H. Rather careless, but then, moving a body in broad daylight, even with the cover of a village fete, must have been terribly stressful. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Inspector Slack was staring at Dr. Haydock with dawning comprehension, while the vicar looked as though his faith in human nature had received yet another devastating blow. You see, Miss Marple said gently, Gerald Linden came to St. Mary Mead not to blackmail anyone, but to confess. He contacted you, Doctor, because he needed medical certification that certain artifacts in his possession were authentic before he could return them to the proper authorities. He trusted you completely. After all, you had been providing such certifications for years as part of the smuggling operation. Dr. Haydock's composure was beginning to crack, fine lines of strain appearing around his eyes. This is preposterous. I've dedicated my life to helping people and making a tidy profit from stolen antiquities, Miss Marple observed. But when Gerald threatened to expose the entire operation, you realized that your respectable practice, your position in the community, everything you had built would be destroyed. So you arranged to meet him privately, ostensibly to help with his confession, but actually to silence him permanently. She looked directly at the doctor, her mild blue eyes holding depths of steel. The sleeping draught you prescribed for the vicar's insomnia, the empty bottle I found in your surgery's rubbish bin, provided the means to subdue him. The chloroform ensured he would never wake up. And your medical knowledge told you exactly how to strike the fatal blow. But then you faced the problem of the body. You couldn't leave it at your surgery, and you needed time to arrange an alternative suspect. So you moved him to the summer house, using the stolen key, and carefully arranged the scene to implicate Mrs. Weatherby. The weapon, wiped clean of prints, her scarf, placed just so. Even the mud on his heels from being dragged across your garden. Dr. Haydock stood slowly, his face pale but his voice steady. You cannot prove any of this, Miss Marple. Speculation and coincidence, nothing more. Perhaps not, she conceded. But I suspect the police will find the evidence they need when they search your surgery more thoroughly. The blood traces you missed, the medical supplies you used, perhaps even Gerald Linden's missing satchel, hidden somewhere you thought it would never be found. Inspector Slack was already moving toward the door, his hand reaching for his whistle to summon assistance. But Dr. Haydock made no attempt to flee. Instead, he sank back into his chair with the resigned air of a man whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around him. 20 years, he said quietly. 20 years of building a practice, earning respect, helping people. And it all ends because one man developed a conscience. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with their familiar, comforting rhythm. It ends, Doctor, because you chose profit over principle and murder over justice. Gerald Linden may have been a smuggler, but he was trying to make amends. You, I'm afraid, were only trying to save yourself. As Inspector Slack's whistle shrilled across the peaceful village morning, Miss Marple reflected that the truth, like her knitting, required patience and careful attention to detail. But once the pattern was clear, the final result was inevitable, and in this case, long overdue. The hours following Dr. Haydock's quiet arrest passed with the peculiar stillness that settles over a community when its most fundamental assumptions have been shattered. Word of the doctor's confession spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable certainty of morning mist, carrying with it a chill that no amount of afternoon sunshine could dispel. Miss Marple found herself once again in the vicarage drawing-room, though the atmosphere had transformed completely from the scene of revelation just hours earlier. Dr. Haydock sat with the resigned composure of a man who had finally set down a burden too heavy to carry, his professional authority stripped away to reveal something far more human and infinitely more tragic. "I suppose," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult diagnoses, "that I always knew this moment would arrive. One cannot build a life on deception without eventually watching the foundation crumble." Inspector Slack had summoned Sergeant Lake to record the confession, and the scratch of pencil on paper provided an oddly comforting counterpoint to the doctor's methodical recounting of 15 years of carefully orchestrated crime. "It began during the war in Cairo," Haydock continued, accepting the cup of tea the vicar nervously offered. "Weatherby and Linden needed someone with medical credentials to certify artifacts as modern reproductions for customs purposes. I needed money to establish my practice when I returned to England. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial, even patriotic in a way. We were preserving treasures that might otherwise be lost to bureaucratic indifference." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm as she listened, though her keen eyes never left the doctor's face. "And did preservation become murder, Doctor?" "When Gerald Linden developed a conscience," Haydock replied with bitter precision. 3 weeks ago, he contacted me. Said he had cancer, 6 months at most, and wanted to make restitution before he died. He planned to confess everything to the British Museum, return what artifacts he still possessed, and provide documentation of the entire network. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft whisper of wool through Miss Marple's fingers. "I tried to dissuade him," the doctor continued. "Explained that his confession would destroy innocent people. Myself, certainly, but also collectors who had unknowingly purchased pieces through legitimate channels. He was sympathetic but immovable. Said he had made his peace with the consequences." "So you arranged to meet him at your surgery?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "I told him I would help prepare the documentation for his confession, that my medical expertise would lend credibility to his claims. He arrived by train, carrying that satchel with 15 years of records. I offered him tea, heavily drugged with the sleeping draught I'd been prescribing to the vicar. When he lost consciousness, I administered chloroform to ensure he wouldn't wake." Raymond, who had been summoned by Inspector Slack, leaned forward with horrified fascination. "And then? The blow to the head was necessary to make it appear as a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. I used a tire iron from my motor car, something that would leave the right sort of wound. But then I faced the problem of disposal." Haydock's clinical detachment was chilling in its matter-of-factness. "I couldn't leave him at my surgery, and I needed time to arrange an alternative suspect." "The summer house," Miss Marple observed quietly. "I waited until most people were watching the brass band competition. Dragged him through the back gardens using the wheelbarrow from my potting shed. It's not far, really, though it felt like miles. I had stolen the summer house key days earlier, knowing I might need a secure location. The doorstop was there, convenient and untraceable." As if summoned by his words, Constable Polk appeared in the doorway with news from the surgery search. "Found it all, sir," he reported to Inspector Slack. "Hidden beneath the dispensary floorboards, the victim's satchel, a ledger going back 20 years, and correspondence with dealers in London. Enough evidence to hang him twice over." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the doctor with something approaching compassion. "You made one crucial error, Doctor. You assumed that because you understood the mechanics of death, you understood the psychology of murder. but you forgot that human nature leaves traces as distinctive as fingerprints. What gave me away? Haydock asked with genuine curiosity. Several things, but most particularly your reaction when I mentioned the smell young Timothy detected. Every woman in the room immediately began cataloguing who wore what perfume. Only you corrected me to say it was medicinal, because you needed it to be medicine rather than perfume. If it were perfume, suspicion might fall on any woman. If medicinal, then only someone with professional access could be implicated. She picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. That and the simple matter of timing. You were so precise about the moment of death being instantaneous, yet the medical evidence showed he had been unconscious for some time before the fatal blow. For a man of your training to make such an error suggested it served a specific purpose, establishing your alibi. Mrs. Weatherby and Elspeth arrived as the formal proceedings concluded, both women looking as though they had aged years in the span of days. The older woman's hands no longer trembled, and there was a lightness in her bearing that spoke of an enormous weight lifted. "I cannot thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "I thought the village would never forgive me for bringing this darkness to St. Mary Mead. Now I understand that the darkness was already here, hiding behind the most respectable of facades." "Human nature," Miss Marple replied gently, "is remarkably consistent across all social strata. Greed, fear, and pride follow predictable patterns, regardless of education or position. Dr. Haydock made the fatal error of believing himself cleverer than those around him, and that arrogance created the very mistakes that exposed his guilt." As Inspector Slack prepared to escort the doctor away, the full weight of the tragedy settled over the assembled group. A respected physician, a pillar of the community, revealed as both smuggler and murderer, it was the sort of scandal that would echo through St. Mary Mead for generations. Yet as the police cars departed and evening settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected that truth, like her knitting, required patience and careful attention to detail. The pattern had finally emerged complete, though the cost had been higher than anyone could have anticipated. Gerald Linden had died trying to make amends for his crimes, while his murderer had sacrificed everything, honor, career, freedom, to protect profits built on stolen heritage and falsified documents. The case was closed, justice would be served, but the innocence of St. Mary Mead had been forever altered in the process. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she knew that while the village would recover, as it always did, the knowledge that evil could wear such a respectable face would remain. A quiet shadow in the collective memory, and perhaps a necessary reminder that human nature, in all its complexity, was never quite as simple as it appeared on the surface. The Sunday morning that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest dawned with that particular brightness reserved for days of moral reckoning, bathing St. Mary Mead in sunlight that seemed both cleansing and slightly intrusive. The village had begun performing that curious social alchemy by which even the most shocking events are gradually absorbed into the ordinary fabric of community life, though the process was neither swift nor simple. The healing ritual, the church bells rang out across the village green with their customary vigor, summoning a congregation notably larger than usual. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed pew, observing the subtle shifts in village dynamics with the practiced eye of someone who understood that communities, like individuals, required rituals to process trauma. Mrs. Weatherby and Elspeth occupied the pew directly across the aisle, their presence a testament to courage rather than retreat. The older woman wore a new hat, a modest affair adorned with violets rather than her usual somber black, and held her head high, meeting curious glances with dignified composure. The vicar's sermon spoke of forgiveness and the dangers of hidden sin, his voice trembling only slightly as he navigated the delicate territory between pastoral comfort and moral instruction. Several members of the congregation shifted uncomfortably, perhaps reflecting on their own small compromises and buried secrets. Inspector Slack stood at the back of the church like a secular guardian, his presence a reminder that divine justice occasionally required assistance from earthly authorities. Changed circumstances. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the case continued to reshape village life in ways both expected and surprising. Mrs. Weatherby and Elspeth had become, somewhat to their amazement, objects of sympathy rather than suspicion. The revelation that they had been victims of circumstance rather than perpetrators of crime had transformed public opinion with remarkable speed. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been among the most vocal in condemning the widow, now championed her cause with equal vigor, declaring that she had always sensed something questionable about Dr. Haydock's manner, a convenient revision of memory that Miss Marple noted with wry amusement. The transformation in Elspeth was particularly marked. The pale, anxious girl who had hovered at the edges of the fate like a frightened sparrow had been replaced by a young woman who walked with steady purpose and spoke with quiet confidence. Under Miss Marple's gentle encouragement, she had begun assisting at the library 2 afternoons a week, finding in books and quiet service a path toward healing. Mr. Simon Clode's situation proved more complex. Though not implicated in the murder itself, his entanglement in the smuggling network could not be entirely concealed. Discreet arrangements had been made through London solicitors to ensure that certain details remained out of the newspapers, but his business suffered irreparable damage. Within a week of Dr. Haydock's arrest, Claude had departed for the continent, leaving behind a shuttered shop and a collection of Egyptian artifacts that would eventually find their way to the British Museum, an ironic fulfillment of Gerald Lyndon's dying wish. Acknowledgements and resolutions. Inspector Slack had visited Miss Marple before his departure, offering thanks that were grudging but genuine. "I would have gotten there eventually," he insisted, though they both understood this was unlikely. "But I'll admit, Miss Marple, your understanding of human nature proved invaluable. The way you spotted those inconsistencies, the timing, the psychological patterns, it was quite remarkable." She had accepted his praise with characteristic modesty, though she reflected privately that the real skill lay not in spotting clues, but in understanding what they revealed about the human heart. Dr. Haydock had been undone not by forensic evidence or brilliant deduction, but by the simple fact that his behavior had been inconsistent with genuine innocence. Mrs. Weatherby and Elspeth had visited that same afternoon, bringing with them the small Egyptian cat figurine that had played such a crucial role in the investigation. "We cannot bear to keep it," Elspeth explained, unwrapping the piece with careful hands. "Too many associations with death and deception." Miss Marple examined the artifact, authenticated by the British Museum as genuinely valuable, and made a decision that seemed to surprise even herself. "I shall donate it to the museum in Gerald Lyndon's name," she announced, a small memorial to a man who, despite his crimes, tried to make amends at the end. The deeper patterns. As the immediate drama faded, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the deeper patterns the case had revealed. St. Mary Mead was, she reflected, rather like a drawing room, so enclosed that one could not help observing the intricate weave of human relationships and the subtle threads of motivation that bound people together. A village was never merely a collection of houses and gardens, but a complex ecosystem of hopes, fears, resentments, and quiet acts of courage. The murder had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. Dr. Haydock had not been a monster in the conventional sense. He had been a gifted physician who had saved lives, even as he profited from theft, a respected community member who had allowed ambition to corrupt his purpose. His tragedy lay not in sudden madness, but in the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, each small compromise making the next easier until murder seemed like a reasonable solution to an inconvenient problem. Yet the case had also revealed the persistence of human decency. Elspeth's courage in bringing forward the figurine, Mrs. Weatherby's decision to return and face suspicion rather than flee, Even young Timothy Bates, with his keen observation of an odd smell. All these small acts of truth had helped tilt the balance toward justice. The continuing mystery. On a mild evening a week later, Miss Marple sat in her garden as twilight settled over the village, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, comforting rhythm. The pattern was complex, requiring careful attention to every stitch, but she knew that with patience and persistence, the design would eventually emerge complete and perfect. Just like life in St. Mary Mead, she mused with a gentle smile. The surface might appear simple, even mundane to the casual observer. But for those who understood where to look, who comprehended the intricate patterns of human nature, there was always a deeper story waiting to be told. The village would recover from this scandal, as it had recovered from others, but the knowledge that evil could wear such respectable faces would remain, a quiet shadow in the collective memory, and perhaps a necessary reminder that human nature was never quite as simple as it appeared. People preferred to think of Dr. Haydock's crimes as a singular aberration, rather than the inevitable culmination of small choices made over many years. It was more comfortable to believe in sudden madness than in gradual moral decay. But Miss Marple knew better. She understood that character was revealed not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when no one was watching, in the accumulation of small decisions that ultimately determined whether one walked toward light or darkness. The eternal cycle. As the church bells chimed 7 o'clock and the sounds of ordinary village life resumed, children being called in for supper, dogs barking in distant gardens, the gentle murmur of evening conversations, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go inside. The case was closed, justice would be served, and life would continue its orderly progression. Yet she knew that somewhere, in some other seemingly peaceful corner of England, a different pattern of small lies and unacknowledged desires was quietly weaving itself together, waiting for the dropped stitch or pulled thread that would reveal what lay beneath the surface. Human nature, in all its complexity, would continue to provide endless variations on its eternal themes of love and hatred, greed and generosity, fear and courage. And she, in her quiet way, would continue to observe, understand, and occasionally intervene when justice required a gentle but firm hand to guide it toward the truth. The mystery of Gerald Lyndon's death had been solved, but the greater mystery of human nature remained as compelling and inexhaustible as ever. A pattern too complex to be fully unraveled, yet too important to be ignored by those with eyes to see and hearts to understand.